The first night in the house felt heavier than it should have. I'd moved plenty of times, lived in apartments crowded with thin walls and noisy neighbors, but this was my first actual house. My first time being fully alone in a place big enough for echoes. I told myself the heaviness was just the quiet, the kind that sits on your chest because it's unfamiliar. That's what I believed until the second night. The house sat at the end of an old suburban street in upstate New York. I'd taken a job transfer and needed something quickly. The listing had come cheap, too cheap, but the realtor shrugged and blamed the sinking market, said the seller needed out fast. The place looked normal enough. 2 stories, weathered blue siding, a yard that needed love. Inside, nothing remarkable. Worn carpets, outdated wallpaper, the faint smell of bleach. It felt empty in a way that seemed normal for a house without furniture. Still, I noticed things, like a scuff on the baseboard in the hallway, long and dark, as if something heavy had been dragged along it, or the attic door hanging slightly crooked on its hinge, like it had been pulled from below instead of opened from above. Little details that I filed under old house quirks. The first night I was too tired to unpack anything except my mattress and a single lamp. I ate a microwaved burrito and listened to the quiet. It was almost peaceful until I heard the sound, a faint shuffle upstairs. I froze. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't pipes, it was the sound of feet dragging across carpet. I waited, listening hard, telling myself it was just the house settling. But the sound continued for a few seconds, slow, steady, deliberate, before stopping. I told myself it was my imagination, brushed my teeth, and went to bed. But even as exhaustion pulled me under, I kept one ear open, waiting for more footsteps. Morning came with sunlight that made the house seem harmless. I spent the day unpacking dishes and clothes, setting up a makeshift office, trying to carve out familiarity. Every now and then I thought I heard something, a creak in the hallway, a tap near the window, but every time I went to investigate, nothing was there. I kept the radio on after that. When the sun went down, the house changed again. The air felt thick, like humidity without any heat. My skin prickled every time I passed the bottom of the stairs. It felt like standing in someone's breath. I tried to ignore it. By midnight, I was lying on my mattress, lamp on, scrolling on my phone. That's when the thump came. It was right above me, in the attic. Not a small noise, a heavy one. Something falling or being dropped. I held my breath, waiting for silence to return. But instead came a second thump, then a slow dragging sound. I stared up at the ceiling, following the noise as it moved across the attic floor, across the length of the room, toward the attic entrance in the hallway. The dragging stopped. A soft, deliberate knock followed. 3 slow taps on the attic door. I didn't move for almost an hour until the house finally went quiet again. The next morning, I tried to talk myself out of the fear. Maybe an animal had gotten in. A raccoon. A squirrel. Something that made noise and knocked things around. I bought earplugs that afternoon. I also bought a cheap security camera and set it facing the hallway just to reassure myself, just to prove there wasn't something wrong. That night, I slept with the bedroom door shut and the camera blinking red outside. Around 3 in the morning, something woke me. Not footsteps or dragging. A voice. Soft. Muffled. I sat up slowly. My heart hammered. I strained to hear, holding my breath. The voice came again. Not words. Just a low whisper, like someone talking to themselves through a thin wall. It seemed to come from the vents, traveling the length of the house. I climbed out of bed and stepped into the hallway, holding my phone like a flashlight. The whispering was stronger there, louder, drifting from above. The attic. A cold draft brushed down the back of my neck and I shivered. I looked up. The attic door was open. Not wide, just a few inches, but enough to see darkness seeping out like a thick shadow. The ladder was still tucked up. The hatch had simply been lifted. Something had pushed it open from inside. I backed away slowly, refusing to turn my back on it, and locked myself in my room until dawn. When I checked the security camera footage, my stomach twisted. From 2:58 to 3:04 a.m., the footage went completely black. No static, no glitches. Just black. And then the camera came back on, recording the attic door already cracked open. No explanation. I didn't want to stay another night. I called the realtor, asked casually if anyone had access to the house, a spare key, a contractor, anything. No, she said. House has been empty since January. Why did the previous owners leave? I asked. Personal reasons. Which were? She paused. They didn't say. That was the first time I realized she was lying. I hung up and stood in the kitchen, listening to the house breathe around me. The walls settled, the floor creaked, the vents whispered. It felt like the house was listening too. I left for work early, stayed late, and returned just long enough to shower and try to sleep. I convinced myself nothing could happen if I stayed in my room with the lights on. But on the fourth night, everything escalated. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when I heard the noise again. A soft shuffle, then a slow step, then another. Coming down the stairs, someone was walking down from the second floor. I turned off the bathroom light, holding my breath. The hallway outside was dim, lit by a single lamp. The stairs were just out of sight around the corner. The steps continued, steady, heavy, too heavy to be imagination. My heart pounded in my throat. Then the steps stopped at the bottom of the stairs. Silence. Long, suffocating silence. I waited for movement, breathing, anything. When nothing happened after a full minute, I stepped quietly into the hallway and peeked around the corner. No one was there. But something else was. A long smear of dark brown on the wall, like someone had dragged their hand across it while descending. The smear curved and dipped, flaking at the edges, old and dried. It hadn't been there when I moved in. Behind me, the bathroom door creaked open on its own. I ran straight out the front door. I sat in my car until sunrise. That morning I went into the attic. I don't know why. Curiosity mixed with anger maybe, or desperation. I needed proof of anything, an animal, a squatter, something logical. The attic was small, dark, dusty, except for one corner. There the dust had been cleared in a perfect oval shape. Something had been lying there, recently. Next to the spot was a tiny piece of fabric, a bit of white cotton like from a shirt or pajamas. The back of my neck went ice cold. I climbed down and closed the attic door, pushing a chair underneath it even though the idea felt laughably useless. I didn't sleep that night. I packed instead, stuffing clothes and toiletries and my laptop into bags. I was leaving first thing in the morning, but the house wasn't done with me. Around 3 a.m., I heard a soft scratching at my bedroom door. Not forceful. Soft, repetitive, scratch, 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 like fingernails. I sat frozen on the floor, back pressed to the wall, staring at the shadows under the door. The scratching grew louder, faster, almost excited. Then it stopped. A moment later, something breathed under the door. A deep inhale, then a slow exhale. Hot air curled through the gap, brushing my toes. I nearly screamed. The door handle turned, slowly, silently. I backed toward the window, ready to climb out if I had to. The handle turned all the way. The latch clicked. I braced myself. But the door didn't open. The handle simply rotated back into place, like something had changed its mind. I spent the rest of the night with the window open, ready to jump. At dawn, I grabbed my bags and fled. I didn't look back. I didn't close the door behind me. I drove until my hands stopped shaking. A week later, the realtor called. She sounded annoyed. We had an inspector walk through. You left the attic door wide open, she said. I didn't go back inside, I told her. Well, she sighed. Someone did. My blood ran cold. How do you know? I asked. There were footprints in the hallway, bare footprints, leading from the attic to the stairs. I hung up on her. I never returned. The house is listed again now. Cheap. Too cheap. I wonder what the next buyer will hear on their first night. Story the end. The first night in the new house should have felt like a milestone, like I'd finally stepped into my own life instead of borrowing someone else's. That's what my sister kept telling me when she helped unload the last of the boxes from her SUV. She hugged me, said she was proud, and drove off before the December sky had fully darkened. I watched her taillights disappear down the long rural road and tried to convince myself that the sudden quiet wasn't unsettling. The house had been a bargain, suspiciously so, considering the size. A two-bedroom place, old but solid, sitting on a wooded acre outside a small Pennsylvania town. I had checked for structural issues, had asked all the right questions, but the seller mostly just smiled too much and said, "People want bigger, newer places now." Something in his tone had sounded forced, but I ignored it. Inside, the house felt colder than the outside air. The heating system rattled like it was coughing dust out of its lungs. Every footstep echoed in that unfamiliar way empty houses have, where sound seems to bounce off the walls as if trying to escape. I set up the bedroom first. needing at least one space that didn't feel like I was squatting. The rest of the boxes stayed downstairs, stacked near the kitchen. I ate a microwaved burrito sitting on the counter, staring at the dim window over the sink. Outside was so black it felt like the world ended 5 feet from the house. By 10 o'clock, exhaustion settled into me like heavy sand. I crawled into bed fully dressed and pulled the blankets up high. I left the bedroom door cracked open, something I never did at my old apartment, and left the hallway light on. I didn't want complete darkness. Not tonight. I had drifted in and out of sleep for what felt like hours until a sound snapped me awake. Not loud. Just wrong. It came from downstairs, a soft, dragging noise like someone sliding their feet slowly across the floor. My eyes flew open. I held my breath and listened. The house went perfectly still. No heater. No creaking. No wind outside. I almost convinced myself I had imagined the noise when something clicked lightly, like a door closing very softly. I sat up, heart pounding, throat suddenly dry. The cracked open bedroom door felt like a threat now. The sliver of dim light from the hallway stretched across the floor like a warning. I swung my legs out of bed and stood, trying not to make any noise. I took my phone from the nightstand and creeped toward the doorway. I hadn't bought new batteries for my flashlight yet, so the phone's weak glow would have to do. When I stepped into the hallway, the air felt colder, noticeably colder. My breath nearly fogged. Something was wrong with that. I crept to the top of the stairs and pointed my phone down. The living room was dark except for the faint, distant glow from the nightlight I'd plugged in near the kitchen. It illuminated a few boxes and the edge of the counter. Nothing else. But the basement door, the door I was sure I had closed earlier, was open. Barely open. Maybe an inch or two. But I could see the black slice of space behind it. A tremor pulsed through my chest. I backed up slowly, step by step, not taking my eyes off that door. Once inside my bedroom, I shut the door and locked it. I'd never locked my bedroom door in my entire adult life. Sleep didn't come for hours. The next morning, sunlight spilling through the blinds made the fear of last night seem ridiculous. Houses make noises. Old hinges shift. Doors don't close all the way. I told myself all of that while brushing my teeth, though my hands wouldn't stop trembling. But when I went downstairs, I stopped cold at the bottom step. The basement door was closed, latched from the outside. I stood there for a minute or two, brain running through explanations, none of which made sense. I hadn't touched it since the night before. I lived alone. My sister hadn't come back. No one else had a key. I made breakfast anyway, forcing myself to act like nothing had happened. Scrambled eggs, toast, coffee. I even wandered around the living room opening boxes just to keep myself busy. Around noon, when the December light had thinned out behind gray clouds, I heard something again. A soft thump from the basement. I froze. Then I laughed aloud, but it came out shaky. Probably an old furnace kicking around down there. Or a pipe settling, except the heater wasn't running. And the house didn't have a furnace. It had an electric heat pump. I stared at the basement door until my courage dried up completely. I didn't open it. I didn't even go near it. That night, I left a lamp on in the living room as well as the hallway. I watched a movie until nearly 2 a.m., trying to drown out the feeling of being watched. Every now and then I heard faint creaks, soft enough that I could pretend they were normal. But around 2:20, the noises changed. They grew deliberate, rhythmic, step, step, step. From the basement stairs. I muted the TV and sat absolutely still. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out the sound until I forced myself to breathe slowly so I could listen again. The steps stopped, then something brushed the inside of the basement door. Not loud, not aggressive, just testing. My phone buzzed in my hand, nearly making me scream. It was a text from my sister. "How's the house treating you? Still alive? Lol." I stared at the message and slowly typed back with trembling fingers. "I think someone's in the basement." 3 dots appeared almost instantly. "Call the police." I thought about it, really thought about it. But what could I say? That I heard sounds? That a door opened by itself? I didn't want to sound paranoid on my first week living alone. Another message popped up. "Please just call." I didn't. Another soft brush against the basement door made my stomach flip. That was all the motivation I needed. I went upstairs, locked the bedroom door again, and stayed under the blankets with my phone clutched against my chest. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I finally opened the basement door. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I was tired of feeling terrified in the place I was supposed to call home. I grabbed a flashlight from the hardware store bag by the counter, clicked it on, and pulled the door open fully. A blast of cold air hit me, far colder than the rest of the house. The basement stairs creaked under my feet as I descended slowly. Each step groaned like it was warning me to turn back. The beam from the flashlight trembled over the cement floor. Everything looked normal. Boxes the cellar had left behind, a workbench, old paint cans. Then I heard it. A soft shifting sound behind the far wall, as if someone had moved, barely. I swept the flashlight toward the far corner. Between two old storage shelves stood a narrow crawl space opening I hadn't noticed before, a black square hole cut into the wall. I moved closer and the temperature dropped again, colder than any basement should ever be. Something glinted on the floor near the opening. I squatted and picked it up. A gold bracelet. Delicate. Feminine. The kind a woman would never take off. The engraving inside the band read, KM. My breath hitched. I didn't know anyone with those initials. The seller hadn't mentioned a previous owner leaving belongings behind. I didn't hear the movement behind me until it was inches away. A shuffle, a scrape, a slow, dragging inhale. I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly, and saw nothing, just empty basement. But the air felt thick, as though someone had just stepped out of reach. I bolted up the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and locked it, though the lock was useless, just a little sliding bolt that wouldn't stop anyone determined. I didn't go near it again for the rest of the day. That night, around the same time as before, the noises returned, but louder now, bolder. Something moved up the basement stairs, one step, then another, slow and steady, like someone taking their time. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it in both hands, standing in the living room with every light on. My phone was in my pocket, set to call 911 with one touch. The steps reached the top. The doorknob rattled. I choked on a gasp and stumbled backward. My heart slammed against my ribs. The doorknob shook harder, like someone twisting it slowly, trying to see if it would give. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence. I didn't move for nearly a full minute. Then my phone vibrated. A text. Unknown number. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. Why did you take her bracelet? My throat closed. My hands went numb. I dropped the knife and it clattered on the hardwood floor. Another text came immediately. She wants it back. Everything in me went cold. I stared at the basement door, waiting, dreading, to see it open. A third text arrived, even though I didn't touch the phone. She's already in the house. A floorboard creaked behind me. I turned slowly. Something stood at the far end of the living room, just beyond the lamp's edge, barely visible. A shape. Small, thin, shoulders hunched, hair hanging forward. I couldn't make out a face, but I heard a sound come from it. A faint, wet whisper. I dropped my phone and ran upstairs so fast I nearly fell. I slammed the bedroom door shut and pressed my back against it. Something brushed the other side almost immediately. Not a knock. A drag. Fingertips trailing up the wood. I screamed for it to stop, voice cracking, but the sound only grew slower, more deliberate. When it reached the height of my head, it paused. The temperature in the room plummeted. Then, in a voice so thin it barely existed, I heard a woman whisper on the other side of the door, "Give it back." I didn't remember losing consciousness. I only remembered the terror. I woke up in daylight on my bedroom floor, freezing cold. The house was completely silent. The bracelet lay on the carpet next to me as if placed there gently. I didn't pack. I didn't look around. I left the house, barefoot, sprinted across the yard to my car, and peeled out of the driveway so fast I tore up the gravel. I never went back. A few days later, the realtor called to ask why I'd abandoned the place. She mentioned, almost casually, that the last owner, a woman in her 40s, had gone missing 2 years earlier. Initials KM. They never found her. Someone else owns the house now. I don't know who. I don't want to know. Sometimes, though, late at night, I get texts from an unknown number. Always the same words. She didn't want you. She still wants someone. Story the end. The first night in the new house was supposed to feel like a beginning. A clean slate after too many years of cramped apartments, street noise, and neighbors who slammed doors at 3 a.m. Instead, it felt like a mistake. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by stacked boxes, the last traces of daylight fading through the windows. The house was older than the listing photos suggested, with slanted floors, crown molding cracked just slightly at the corners, and a faint smell of old paper, like someone had stored books everywhere. It wasn't bad, just strange, like stepping into a place that remembered things you didn't. My real estate agent had called it historic, which I guessed was a nicer way of saying it creaked when the temperature changed and had windows that sounded haunted when the wind blew. Still, I'd taken the deal. The price had been too good to refuse, and I'd told myself the quirks were part of its charm. By the time I unpacked enough to find my blankets, the sun was gone entirely. The overhead lights flickered weakly. I frowned and flipped the switch again. Same result. Dim, buzzing bulbs that cast sickly yellow pools of light instead of the bright glow I wanted. I'd deal with the wiring later, I told myself. I made a simple dinner, ate standing at the counter because the table was still in pieces, and listened to the silence of the house breathe around me. Cities had a constant hum, cars outside, people walking past, distant sirens or music. Here, though, nothing. No traffic, no neighbors, no dogs barking, just the house, just me. After washing the dishes, I went upstairs. The staircase groaned beneath my steps in long, aching creaks that sounded almost like voices if I didn't listen too carefully. The bedroom at the end of the hallway was the only one I'd bothered to set up earlier, throwing a mattress and a few blankets on the floor. Nothing else. Boxes lined the walls like silent witnesses. I crawled under the blankets, exhausted. Moving always drained me, but this time it felt heavier, like the house itself was watching me settle in. It took a long time to fall asleep. I woke up sometime after midnight to a faint tapping sound. For a moment I lay still, blinking in the dark. The room was quiet. The tapping came again. Soft, rhythmic. I sat up, trying to place it. It wasn't coming from the window or the door. It was coming from the floorboards beneath me. Tap, 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 like someone knocking from downstairs. A chill crawled along my spine, and I held my breath without meaning to. I'd never been the paranoid type, but being alone in a place I didn't know made every sound feel sinister. Tap, tap, tap. I got to my feet, heart thumping, and opened the bedroom door. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, unlit except for the faint glow of the living room light drifting up the stairs. Tap, tap. The sound stopped. I stepped slowly down the hall, each board groaning under my weight. Reaching the top of the stairs, I listened again. Silence. I told myself it was the house settling. Old houses made noise. Everyone said that. Still, I went downstairs to check. The first floor was exactly as I'd left it, boxes unopened, the kitchen light humming softly, the front door locked. There was nothing out of place. I stayed awake for over an hour, waiting for the tapping to return, but it didn't. Eventually, I went back upstairs and forced myself to sleep. The next morning felt calmer, sunlight brightened the house, making everything seem less threatening. I made coffee, found a radio station that didn't fuzz out every 30 seconds, and unpacked until the living room looked almost like a place someone lived in. But even during the day, the house had this undercurrent. Like I could feel movement somewhere nearby. Soft, quiet, never quite close enough to pinpoint. Shadows lingered where they shouldn't. Cold spots dragged across my skin as I walked by, the kind you'd feel standing under an air vent, except there were no vents in those spots. Once, while carrying a box to the basement, I thought I heard breathing behind me, slow, shallow, like someone trying not to be noticed. But when I spun around, no one was there. The basement door hung open, yawning into darkness. I told myself it was my imagination twisting the empty quiet into something more. The second night was worse. Sometime after 1 a.m., I woke to the closet door in my bedroom slowly creaking open. I froze. I had closed it before bed. I remembered doing it because I hated seeing the darkness inside. Now it was sliding open inch by inch, hinges whining softly. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The door stopped halfway. Nothing came out. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it toward the closet. The shelves were empty, except for the few clothes I'd hung earlier. No intruder, no animal. But the air inside the closet was freezing cold, so cold I could see my breath drifting in the flashlight beam. I shut the door and didn't sleep again until morning. The next day, I called the real estate agent to ask if anyone else had lived here recently. They said the house had been empty for almost 3 years. The owner had moved to a nursing home and passed away sometime after. No renters, no squatters, no one with reason to come inside. I asked if anyone had complained about strange noises before. The agent laughed and said, "Old houses make sounds. You'll get used to it." I didn't. Late that afternoon, I heard footsteps upstairs while I was unpacking the kitchen. Slow ones. Too heavy to be the house settling. They walked across the bedroom floor, paused, then moved again. I set down the box I was carrying and held my breath. A final creak echoed from the hallway upstairs, right outside the bedroom door. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox, gripping the handle so tight my knuckles hurt, and ran up the stairs. The second floor was empty. The hallway was still. The bedroom was just as I'd left it, but the blankets on the mattress were rumpled, pushed back as though someone had sat down on them. That night, I slept on the couch downstairs with every light on. Around 3:30 a.m., the light in the kitchen flickered, hummed, and burned out. The living room lamp went next, then the hallway. One by one, every bulb in the house went dark. I sat up on the couch, heart pounding. My phone flashlight was the only glow left. Something moved near the bottom of the stairs. I didn't see it directly. I saw the shadow first, a tall shape that stretched across the floor, cast by nothing. It moved slowly, deliberately, inching toward the couch. I scrambled off the cushions, grabbed my car keys, and bolted for the front door. The air behind me shifted. I heard the faintest whisper, like someone exhaling my name. I didn't look back. Outside, the night felt alive, the wind cold against my face. I ran to my car, fumbled with the keys, and finally unlocked it. By the time I got inside and slammed the door, my hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped them. I drove straight to the next town, booked a cheap motel room, and sat awake until sunrise. I went back the next afternoon with two neighbors I'd met earlier that week. They didn't believe me, but they agreed to walk through the house so I could grab essentials. Every light worked again. The blankets on the mattress were smooth. Nothing was disturbed. My neighbors left after 5 minutes, saying the house felt completely normal. But I could feel the weight of it pressing down around me, the same cold presence lingering just behind me, no matter where I stood. That was the last time I stepped foot inside. I sold the house at a loss 2 weeks later to a couple who seemed thrilled to get such a charming fixer-upper. I never told them what happened. Maybe I should have, but even if I had, they wouldn't have believed me. Some houses are empty. Some houses are lonely. And some houses are just waiting for someone to come home. Story. The end. The last box thudded onto the hardwood floor as I shut the front door behind me, locking it with a slow click that echoed louder than it should have in the empty house. My breath hung in the cool air for a moment. The place felt colder than it had during the walkthrough a few weeks earlier, when the realtor had smiled stiffly and insisted the heating system was temperamental but functional. I'd brushed it off. I needed a fresh start after everything. The breakup, the job change, the months of grinding uncertainty. The house, tucked away at the edge of a rural Maine town, was the cheapest rental within miles. Cheap enough that I tried not to think too hard about why. I walked through the living room, my footsteps hollow in the large space. The ceilings were high, the walls a yellowed white that looked older up close. The windows were tall but let in almost no warmth. The air smelled faintly of old paint and something musty, like fabric left too long in storage. The last tenant, according to the realtor, had left abruptly, and she'd said it the way someone might say the dog ran away instead of the dog died. I didn't ask questions. The less I knew, the easier it was to pretend nothing was wrong. That first evening, I unpacked only the bare essentials. A coffee mug, a blanket, a pillowed air mattress I'd brought to tide me over until the bed frame arrived, and my laptop. I ordered Chinese takeout from the only place open after 6 in town. The delivery guy made the drop-off at the gate at the end of the long gravel driveway, refusing to drive up. "Bad luck up that road," he muttered, handing me the bag. "Nasty things in the woods." When I asked him to explain, he just shook his head and drove off. I told myself small towns always had weird superstitions. Still, walking up the driveway with the plastic bag crinkling in my hand, I kept glancing at the tree line. The woods pressed in close on both sides, oak and pine, thick and dark, even though it wasn't fully night yet. Inside, I ate in front of my laptop. The Wi-Fi was decent, better than I expected. I watched an old sitcom to fill the silence. But the quiet in the house didn't just sit in the background. It pressed. Every time the laugh track cut, I heard something shifting in the walls or settling in the ceiling. I kept turning the volume up. By 11, my eyes burned with exhaustion. I turned off the lights and curled up on the air mattress. The house made a deep groaning sound, like it was breathing out after holding something in all day. The sound made my skin prick. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and forced my eyes shut. At 2:14 a.m., I woke up abruptly. No dream. No noise. Just the very distinct feeling that something else in the house had changed, that the silence wasn't the same. I listened hard. Then I heard it. A soft tapping. It came from the wall by the bedroom door, a single light tap. Then another, and another. Slow, spaced out, almost testing. My breath froze. I stayed perfectly still, staring at the closed door. The taps were gentle, like someone lightly knocking with a fingertip. I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe quietly. I told myself the house was old. Pipes, wood, animals in the walls, houses made noises. But the tapping continued for nearly 2 minutes. Steady. Intentional. Then it stopped. I stayed awake until the sky lightened, every muscle tense, waiting for it to start again. It never did. When morning came and sunlight spilled onto the floorboards, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. The next day, I explored the house more thoroughly. It was bigger than it had looked during the viewing. 2 bedrooms, a small office, a living room that stretched unexpectedly long, and an old, unfinished basement that smelled like wet soil and rusted metal. I only made it a few steps down the basement stairs before backing out. Something about the air down there felt heavy, like standing too close to a shut tomb. Instead, I unpacked, cleaned, plugged air fresheners into the walls to try to get the musty smell out, and played music loud enough that the silence couldn't seep back in. That night, it came back anyway. I was brushing my teeth when I saw something in the hallway mirror behind me. It wasn't clear. A faint blur, like a shadow crossing the hallway, even though the lights were on. I spun around so fast the toothbrush flew out of my hand, but nothing was there. Just the long, narrow hall stretching toward the bedrooms. My heart pounded. Reflection tricks, I whispered to myself, gripping the sink. You're tired. But the tapping returned that night, this time from the living room window. I sat up on the air mattress, blanket gathered around me, listening. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, a different rhythm than before, like someone communicating in a code I didn't know. I didn't sleep until daylight again. By the third night, exhaustion made my thoughts fuzzy. I tried to distract myself by messaging friends, but most were busy or asleep. I walked the house with every light on, checking locks, looking for loose shutters or tree branches that might have hit the windows. There were none. Around 11:30 p.m., as I sat on the couch scrolling aimlessly through my phone, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. The air in the room shifted, like a cold draft slipping through even though the windows were shut tight. I sat up straighter. Then the living room ceiling creaked loudly. A sound too heavy for an animal. A steady, dragging creak, like weight shifting across the upper floor, except there wasn't an upper floor. The attic crawl space, maybe? I stared at the ceiling as the noise moved slowly across the length of the house. My chest tightened. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept toward the hallway. The attic entrance was a small hatch in the ceiling near the second bedroom. I'd noticed it earlier, but the realtor had brushed it off. Just storage, probably empty. I stood under it, staring at the square outline in the ceiling. The house had gone silent again, completely silent. My hands shook as I raised the flashlight. Dust drifted from the edges of the hatch. Then, something tapped back. Not from the wall, from above, directly above me. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall with my shoulder. The flashlight nearly slipped from my hand. Another tap, softer, almost playful. I backed down the hall, forcing myself not to turn my back on the attic door until I reached the bedroom and shut myself inside. I didn't sleep, not even for a second. In the daylight, everything felt wrong. The air heavier, the shadows darker even with the sun out. I was jittery, dropping things, flinching at small noises. Around noon, I finally forced myself to check the attic because the alternative was letting my imagination control me completely. I dragged the old step stool from the kitchen, set it under the hatch, and climbed up slowly. Dust coated the edges. I swallowed hard and pushed up. The hatch popped open with a soft groan. Cold air spilled out. I lifted my head into the attic space, shining the flashlight around. It was empty, completely empty except for insulation and bare beams. But as I scanned the far corner, the beam crossed something carved into the wood. Lines. Dozens of them. Vertical tallies carved deep into the beam. 5, 10, 20, more than 100. My blood ran cold. I climbed down fast, closed the hatch, and backed away like it might burst open at any moment. I had to get out of the house, at least for a little while. I got in my car and drove into town, heading to the small library. I needed to look up the property history, find out why it was so cheap, why the last tenant had run. But the library's archives were old school. Paper binders, yellowed pages, handwritten notes clipped to manila folders. After an hour of digging, I found a file about the house's previous occupants. The tenant before me had filed 3 noise complaints: unexplained footsteps, tapping, whispering sounds. He'd claimed someone was getting into the house at night, even though locks weren't broken. The police checked, found nothing. Less than 6 months later, he abandoned the house, leaving his furniture behind. The tenant before him had stayed only 3 months. And before that, there was a newspaper clipping, an older one, about a woman found dead on the property. The article said she'd been discovered inside the basement, no sign of forced entry, cause of death undetermined. The edges of the paper were crinkled like someone had handled it too many times. At the bottom, someone had handwritten a note in red ink. She wasn't alone. No one ever is in that house. A chill swept through me. I slammed the binder shut and left the library immediately. When I reached the house, it was late afternoon. The sun hung low, bleeding orange light across the yard. Something felt off the moment I parked. The front door was slightly open. Only an inch or two, but open. I knew I'd locked it that morning. Absolutely, without question. I stood frozen by the car door. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to call the police without being sure. Maybe I'd locked it wrong. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. I stepped inside, heart pounding so loud it drowned everything else out. The house was unnervingly still. The air felt colder, heavy in a way that made my lungs work harder. I checked every room. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing seemed missing. Then I noticed the bedroom door. It was shut. I never shut that door. Slowly, I walked toward it. My hand hovered over the knob, slick with sweat. I turned it. The room was dim, curtains pulled shut. My air mattress was neatly placed where I'd left it, but something was wrong. The blanket was tucked in. I never tucked it in. And on the pillow, someone had left a small object, a house key, not mine. I stepped back, pulse roaring in my ears. The room suddenly felt too small, too close. A floorboard behind me creaked. I spun around. Nothing. But the air shifted like someone had moved past me, like breath on the back of my neck. I grabbed my backpack, my keys, my wallet, and bolted from the house so fast I nearly slipped on the porch steps. I didn't look back. I got in the car, locked the doors, and floored it down the gravel drive. I didn't go back that night, or the next. On the 3rd day, I returned with a sheriff's deputy to collect the rest of my things. I refused to go inside alone. The deputy walked room to room casually, making idle conversation. "Old houses shift," he said. "Noises always seem bigger when you're here alone." I stayed close behind him, heart still pounding. When we reached the bedroom, he flicked on the light and frowned. "Huh. What?" I whispered. He pointed at the floor. Dust patterns, clear ones, tracks, as if someone had been standing beside the air mattress and kneeling next to it, looking underneath it. My throat tightened painfully. "We need to leave," I said, voice cracking. The deputy did one more sweep before shrugging. "Nothing here now." I grabbed what I could, stuffed it in 2 bags, and walked out. As I reached the doorway, something made me stop. Near the entryway wall, scratched faintly, very faintly, into the paint, were new tally marks, fresh ones, 5, 10, 15. I didn't tell the deputy. I couldn't. I got in my car and drove away from that house forever. I moved states away and tried to start over. New apartment, new job, new everything. But some nights, when the world is still and the lights are off, I hear it again. Tap, 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 always in sets of 5, like tallies, like someone is keeping count of the nights they've found me again. And sometimes lying awake in the dark, I swear I can feel a cold breath behind me, like I'm not alone, like I never was. Story the end. The U-Haul rumbled away down the long, rural road, its taillights shrinking until they vanished behind a bend of bare November trees. For a moment, I just stood on the porch of my new house in upstate New York, hugging my jacket around myself against the early cold, trying to convince the tight feeling in my chest that this was supposed to be a good thing. A fresh start. A place of my own. No roommates. No city chaos. No leftover reminders of a relationship that had ended far more painfully than I wanted to admit. I'd bought the place cheap, almost suspiciously cheap, but foreclosure listings usually were. A one-story ranch house from the late 70s, pale blue siding faded nearly to gray, a detached garage, and a few acres of wooded property behind it. The inspector had said it needed a little TLC, but nothing major. The pictures online made it look lonely in a peaceful way. Seeing it in person at dusk made it look lonely in a very different way. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. The woods looked darker than they should have been, like the trees were huddling together, hiding something behind them. The house's windows reflected nothing but dim orange sky and the silhouette of thin branches. I shook it off and carried the last box inside. The living room was bare except for the rolled-up rug leaning against the wall and a few pieces of mismatched furniture I'd hauled from my old apartment. The air smelled stale, like old carpet, dust, and the faintest trace of mildew. The house had been vacant almost a year. Vacant. That word scraped across my nerves. As I unpacked, the house creaked and clicked with the temperature drop. Normal stuff, I told myself. Old house. New owner. Wood settling outside. No big deal. But part of me still felt like I wasn't alone. The first odd thing happened when I went to set up the Wi-Fi router. I was kneeling by the outlet in the hallway, running the cord along the baseboard when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, definite footsteps. I turned so fast I nearly tipped over. Nothing there, just the dim hallway stretching toward the bedrooms, shadows pooling in the corners. I stood, listening. Silence. Maybe I'd shifted the floorboard somehow. Maybe I was tired. I'd hardly slept the night before the move. I forced myself to finish unpacking. By the time I made a simple dinner and sat on the couch to eat, the house felt less threatening, more like an empty shell waiting to be filled. I put on some music, turned up brighter lights, tried to believe I was settling in. Later, around 10, I shut everything off and flipped the hallway light on before heading to the bedroom. The air in the hall felt noticeably colder, so much so that I could see my breath puff faintly when I exhaled. I checked the thermostat. 68 degrees. Normal. But the hallway didn't feel normal. The vent near the floor rattled softly, like something was brushing against it from the inside. I crouched and pressed my ear toward the metal grate. Something scraped, not like a mouse, not like an animal at all, more like fingernails dragging lightly across the ductwork. My skin prickled. I backed away and walked faster toward the bedroom. I didn't sleep well. Despite leaving the bedside lamp on, the darkness in the room felt too thick, pressing against the corners, creeping into the space under the bed, under the door, through the vent. Every time I shut my eyes, I imagined that scraping sound starting again. Around 3 a.m, I woke abruptly. No reason, no sound, just a sudden jolt of alertness like someone had touched my shoulder. The house was silent, but something felt wrong. I realized after a moment that the hallway light, the one I'd purposely left on, was off. I stared at the crack under the door. Total darkness. I hadn't turned that light off. I lay frozen for almost a full minute before forcing myself to get up and open the door. The hallway looked darker than a hallway should look, like the light was being swallowed instead of simply absent. I reached for the light switch and flicked it. Nothing. I checked the breaker box in the laundry room. Everything looked fine, but the hallway light wouldn't turn back on. When I returned to the hall, something new caught my eye. The air felt warmer again. Normal temperature. No breath mist, but a faint smell hung there. Dirt, sweat, something that belonged outdoors but had been dragged inside. I followed the smell toward the living room, and then I saw it. The rug I'd rolled up and left leaning against the wall was now unrolled across the floor, perfectly flat, perfectly centered. I hadn't touched it. My chest tightened. I backed away slowly, hands shaking, and locked myself in the bedroom for the rest of the night, gripping my phone like it was the only lifeline I had. By morning, I was exhausted, jumpy, and angry at myself. Houses didn't unroll rugs. Lights didn't shut off by themselves unless there was a wiring issue. Vents didn't scrape unless animals were inside them. I convinced myself it was explainable. I convinced myself because I had to. There was nowhere else to go. I went to town for supplies and coffee. On my way out, I noticed the neighbor across the road, a bearded man in his 50s, watching me from his porch. He lifted 2 fingers in a lazy wave. I waved back. When I returned later, he was at the end of his driveway talking to a delivery guy. As I was pulling into mine, he crossed the road and approached. "You're the new owner?" he asked. "Yeah, just moved in yesterday." He nodded slowly. Too slowly. "Haven't been many folks staying in that place more than a month." I forced a laugh. "Yeah? Why's that?" He shrugged one shoulder. "People hear things, old house noises, woods, winter drafts, gets under your skin." His eyes lingered on me too long before he turned and walked away. The way he spoke made my stomach tighten. That night, I kept a baseball bat next to the bed. Around midnight, the vent began rattling softly again. I sat up, heart pounding. A hollow tapping sound echoed from the far end of the duct. 1, pause, 2, pause, 3 in quick succession. I slid off the bed and approached the vent on shaking legs, lifted the grate away, and shined my phone light inside. The metal looked scratched. Not animal scratches. Long, parallel lines too even, too deliberate. Like someone had been dragging their fingers along the inside. I snapped the grate back on and backed away until I hit the opposite wall. Sometime later, maybe an hour, maybe 3, I must have fallen asleep sitting up. When I opened my eyes, the bedroom door was cracked open 2 inches. I had locked it. I checked the lock. Still engaged. That meant someone had unlocked it from the outside. I didn't spend the rest of the night in the bedroom. I took my keys, my bag, and waited in the car until sunrise. The next day, I called an HVAC specialist, telling him I needed the vents checked for animals. He arrived around 9, a stocky guy with a bright orange beanie and a calm, practiced demeanor. He spent almost an hour inspecting the ducts. When he came back in, his face was pale. "Ma'am, nothing living was in your vents," he said quietly, "but you might want to call the police." My blood ran cold. "Why?" He scratched his beard nervously. "Because someone's been in there, crawling, moving around, hiding." I nearly vomited. He went on, voice low. "There's a loose panel in your basement ceiling. Behind it, there's access to the ductwork. Looks like someone cut it open months ago. There are blankets, food wrappers, water bottles. Someone's been staying down there." My hands shook uncontrollably. Are they still there?" He swallowed. "I don't think so." But I didn't stay long. I called the police immediately. 2 officers arrived within 30 minutes. They searched the basement, the vents, the crawl space, the woods. They didn't find anyone. But they found enough to confirm what the HVC guy said. Someone had been living in my house long before I moved in. Someone knew the access points, the hidden spaces, the vents. Someone had been listening, watching, breathing in the same walls. One of the officers pulled me aside after their sweep. "This house was foreclosed after the previous owner disappeared," he said. "We never found him, just assumed he left town. But the space in that basement, the marks, the bedding." He looked toward the basement door. He might never have left. I didn't spend another night there. I didn't even go back inside alone. A week later, with the help of movers and 2 deputies, I got my belongings out. The house is still empty now, at the end of that lonely rural road, lights off, windows dark, a silent shape against the woods. For sale again, cheaper than before. Every few nights since moving away, I dream of the long metal vents winding like tunnels behind the walls. I dream of someone crawling inside them, silently pulling themselves forward with their fingertips. I dream of waking up to the sound of breathing in the duct at the foot of my bed. And sometimes, too often, I wake convinced that the scraping followed me, that it's in the vents of my new place, that someone learned how to move without being seen. Story the end. The real estate agent had called it a starter home, the kind of place young couples bought before kids or careers moved them somewhere bigger. But I wasn't a young couple. It was just me, 29, freshly single for the first time in 6 years and needing a reset. The house wasn't big, 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a narrow kitchen, and wood floors that looked like they'd seen decades of footsteps. But it was mine, my first house. My first real attempt at building a life I actually wanted. The moving van left just after 6 in the evening. The sun was already sliding low behind the trees, taking the late summer warmth with it. The house sighed with the sudden emptiness, as though it wasn't used to so much quiet all at once. I couldn't decide if the silence comforted me or made me uneasy. Boxes covered the living room and kitchen. I tossed my jacket on the couch and opened windows to let in the evening air. It was cooler than I expected, with a faint dampness that clung to the walls. The neighborhood wasn't loud, but I could hear distant traffic and something like kids playing a few houses over. At 8, the sky went a deep navy, and the yard took on that shadowed look houses get just before real darkness sets in. I switched on the porch light. The bulb flickered once, then steadied. I locked the front door out of habit, then triple-checked it for no reason at all. New place jitters, I told myself. I made myself a basic dinner, ate standing at the counter, and figured I should unpack enough to sleep. The hallway upstairs felt narrow and somehow colder than the rest of the house. When I reached the top, I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like when you drive uphill too fast. I tried swallowing to clear it, but nothing changed. The bedroom was empty except for the mattress I dragged up earlier with the help of the movers. I unrolled the new bedding, fluffed a pillow, and set my phone to charge on the floor next to the wall outlet. The room looked bare and almost unfamiliar, like an Airbnb I hadn't fully committed to staying in. Downstairs, something clicked. A short, sharp click, like a lock or latch snapping into place. I froze, the blanket halfway unfolded. Then I heard it again. Not loud, not aggressive, just a soft mechanical click. Old house, I whispered out loud as if saying it made it true. Still, I went back downstairs. The entryway light hummed a little, the bulb casting that warm yellow glow that seemed too dim for comfort. The front door was closed, locked, unmoved. I checked the kitchen next. The sound seemed to have come from there. The fridge hummed steadily. The small window above the sink showed only the porch light, reflecting faintly against darkness. Nothing looked disturbed. I started to turn off the lights when the overhead bulb gave a quick stuttering flicker. Once, twice, then stayed steady. The faint prickle on the back of my neck told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't relaxed, I wasn't comfortable, and I wasn't going to sleep easily. But I went upstairs anyway. I had to start somewhere. Around 2 a.m, something woke me. A sound. I didn't know what it was at first, just that it was wrong enough to drag me out of sleep. I lay still, heart thudding, listening. Then I heard it again, a soft thump. Then another, slow, evenly spaced. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from directly above me. The attic. I tried to rationalize, maybe a raccoon, maybe a squirrel, but the footsteps were too heavy for something that small. And they weren't scrambling or darting like an animal would. They were measured, deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. The sound reached the point directly above my bed, then stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Pregnant, waiting. Then came a lighter sound, like someone shifting their weight. Wood lightly creaking. A single soft scrape traveled across the attic floorboards. Slow, dragging. I sat up, adrenaline spiking so hard it felt like electricity in my veins. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, breath shallow, listening for any sign of movement. But the house went still again. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the pale light creep across the walls. As soon as it was bright enough outside, I got up and pulled down the attic ladder. It groaned loudly, the kind of old metal groan that sounded like a complaint. The air that drifted down smelled stale and strangely cold. The attic wasn't large. Mostly unfinished beams, old insulation, and a floor covered with thick dust. My footsteps left clear impressions as I walked. I swept the flashlight beam across the space, searching corners, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Human footprints. Bare. Leading from the far corner straight across the attic and stopping directly above where my bed sat below. My stomach lurched, but there was no one up there. No place to hide. No sign of anyone living, or dead, who could have made those prints. I backed down the ladder and shoved it closed, the wood banging louder than I intended. My hands shook as I locked myself in the bathroom for 10 minutes, splashing cold water on my face until the shaking stopped. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unpacking, though my mind kept circling back to the attic. Maybe someone had gotten inside before I bought the place. Maybe they had left footprints and left. That made more sense than anything supernatural. By evening, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. I made dinner, watched a movie on my laptop, and even laughed at one point, just to prove to myself the house wasn't controlling me. It was around 11:30 when the tapping started. Soft, methodical, a fingertip tap coming from the bedroom wall. Tap, tap, tap. I turned my head slowly. The tapping stopped the moment I focused on it. I waited. Then from inside the wall, tap, tap. I stood up, blood cold. The tapping grew more insistent. I felt like someone trapped in the wall was knocking to get out. I pressed my palm against the plaster. It vibrated faintly with each hit. I backed away from the wall. That's when the second sound began. A low whisper. Not a voice exactly, but a faint movement of air, like someone breathing quietly just on the other side of the wall. I couldn't make out words, only the cadence of something too intentional to be random air movement. Then a soft exhale right behind me. I spun, a gasp clawing out of my throat. Nothing. Empty room. Unmoved air. I slept downstairs on the couch again. Or tried to. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just out of sight, watching me in the dark. The next morning, I found the attic ladder pulled halfway down. I hadn't touched it since the day before. I left the house immediately, sat in my car for 10 minutes, then drove in circles around town until the panic loosened its grip. I bought coffee I didn't drink, walked through a grocery store without buying anything, then parked at a small lake on the outskirts of town. When I finally went home in the late afternoon, a package sat on the porch. No return address. Inside was a stack of old photographs. Each one was of the house, different rooms in different decades. The first photo was clearly from the 1970s. The living room looked almost identical to mine, except for the furniture. The second photo showed the hallway upstairs. The third showed the attic entrance. The fourth showed the attic interior, though darker and grainier. And the fifth made my stomach drop. It was a photo of me, sleeping in my bed, taken from the attic opening above. My hands shook violently as I flipped to the last one. It was taken from an angle I didn't recognize at first. Then I realized it was the inside of a wall. I dropped the photos on the porch and backed away, hands trembling uncontrollably. I didn't go inside. Couldn't. I called a locksmith and paid him extra to change every lock immediately. When he asked if everything was okay, I shook my head and lied. Just lost some keys. He left. I locked the door behind him. Twice. That night, I slept downstairs again. The couch felt safer, though that was an illusion. Around 3 a.m., the house felt so silent it felt unnatural, an absence of sound, like the air had been vacuumed out. Then came the slow creak of the attic door opening. I didn't move. Couldn't. A second creak. Then the long, metallic scrape of the ladder sliding down. I stared at the archway to the living room, unable to breathe. A soft footstep landed on the upstairs floor. Then another. Then the unmistakable sound of someone descending the ladder, rung by rung. I pressed myself back into the couch cushions, tears pricking at my eyes. The footsteps reached the hallway. Then the stairs. Slowly, someone began walking down toward me. I grabbed my keys silently, slipped out the back door, and ran barefoot across the yard to my car. The engine roared too loudly, the headlights slicing across the front of the house, just in time to see the attic ladder fully extended, though I had left it closed hours ago. I didn't go back inside. Not that night. Not ever. I returned the next morning with a police escort to retrieve my essentials. They found no signs of anyone living in the attic or walls, no footprints, no evidence, just dust, thick and undisturbed as though no one had been inside for years. But before I left, I insisted they check one more thing, the wall in my bedroom. When they cut a small inspection hole, something fell out, a small wooden box. Inside were photos, all of them of people sleeping in the bedroom, different people, different decades. The last photo in the box was of me, sleeping on the couch downstairs, taken the night before. I moved out that afternoon. The house is empty again, on the market, waiting. And sometimes when I think about it late at night, I imagine someone still up there in the attic, watching through cracks in the walls, waiting for the next owner to move in so they can start the cycle again. Story the end. The first night in the new house was supposed to be peaceful. After months of apartment hunting, paperwork, and saving every spare dollar, Megan had finally found a place she could afford, a small, 2-story home on the edge of a quiet Pennsylvania town. It wasn't perfect. The paint peeled around the windows, the porch sagged a little, and the interior smelled faintly of old wood and dust. But it was hers. For the first time in her life, she didn't share a wall with noisy neighbors or have to hear the thump of footsteps above her head. The moving truck had left by late afternoon, leaving Megan alone with a maze of boxes and a growing sense of fatigue. Her dog, Harley, a 3-year-old black lab mix, wandered the unfamiliar rooms with his nose glued to the floor, occasionally letting out a low whine. She assumed it was just nerves from the change in environment. Harley had never lived anywhere this big. By 7 p.m., she had managed to unpack the kitchen, set up the bed, and plug in a few lamps. She ordered a pizza, ate it on the living room floor, and laughed to herself about how adult she felt. When the sun went down, the house felt colder. The furnace rattled every time it kicked on, producing a deep metallic groan that echoed through the vents. Harley would pause, ears up, tail stiff, then slowly relax again. Megan gave his head a reassuring scratch. "It's just an old house," she told him. "Everything's gonna creak." She tried to believe it. By 10, she was upstairs getting ready for bed. She brushed her teeth while Harley lay curled on the bathroom rug. When she turned off the light, the darkness in the hallway seemed thicker than it should have been. The single lamp downstairs didn't cast enough glow to chase away the oppressive shadows. Megan swallowed her unease and climbed into bed. Harley hopped up after her, laying across her feet as he always did. She had barely drifted into that half-sleep between wakefulness and dreaming when she heard it. A sound, soft, deliberate, footsteps, on the first floor. Her eyes snapped open. She held her breath, listening. Harley's head shot up, ears perked. He growled, a low, rumbling warning she had only ever heard on rare occasions. Megan grabbed her phone. "Midnight. Harley," she whispered. Another step, heavier this time. Wood groaned beneath it. Someone was downstairs. Her heart hammered against her chest. She hadn't imagined that. Harley wouldn't react like this to nothing. The house had 2 doors, the front and a back door off the kitchen. She had locked them both. She was sure she had. The footsteps moved again, slow, dragging. Harley jumped off the bed and positioned himself between Megan and the door, muscles tense. She considered calling 911, but something about the situation felt unreal, like the world had slowed down and thickened around her. She strained to hear. Silence. Minutes passed. Eventually Harley's growl faded, though he didn't lie down again. Megan didn't sleep until the sun began to lighten the bedroom windows. The next morning she checked every lock, every window. All locked, all untouched. Nothing seemed disturbed. She tried to brush off the night as exhaustion mixed with nerves from the move. But as she made coffee, she noticed something odd. The dining room chair closest to the kitchen doorway was pulled out. A foot from the table, angled slightly toward the living room. She hadn't touched the dining room last night. Harley barked at it, then hid behind her legs. By late morning, she had convinced herself she must have bumped it during unpacking. People misremember things all the time when they're tired, she reasoned. Still, that night, she double-checked every lock twice. She left the hallway light on. Harley slept beside her, twitchy and alert. Around 3 a.m., the scratching began. It came from the wall behind her headboard, slow, rhythmic, like fingers dragging across wood. Scrape, 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 scrape. She sat up instantly. Harley didn't growl this time. He whined, low and frightened, and backed away from the wall. His eyes never left it. Megan pressed a hand to the plaster. Cold. Probably mice, she whispered. But mice didn't move like that. They scurried. They scratched quickly, like frantically. This sound was patient, intentional. The scraping stopped, and then 3 taps. Knuckles. Megan yanked her hand back as if she'd touched a hot stove. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, she called a home inspector to check for pests. He arrived around noon, spent an hour checking the attic, walls, basement. He emerged shrugging. No mice, no insects, clean walls. You're lucky. Most houses this old aren't. She didn't feel lucky. That evening, she made a point of staying downstairs, watching TV until she felt too exhausted to keep her eyes open. She hoped if she stayed awake long enough, she'd sleep through anything. At midnight, she finally turned off the TV. The moment she did, she heard faint breathing. Not her own, not Harley's. Coming from the dining room. She froze on the couch, listening, heartbeat thundering. The breathing was slow and labored, like someone struggling for air. She grabbed her phone. Opened the camera, slowly raised it toward the dark dining room doorway. Through the screen, something moved. A shape, tall, human-like, standing behind the pulled-out chair. She gasped and dropped the phone. Harley barked wildly, rushing forward, then stopped abruptly at the dining room threshold, refusing to cross it. Megan scrambled for the light switch and flipped it on. The room was empty. The chair, however, was pulled out even farther. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She turned every light in the house on and sat on the couch with Harley pressed against her until dawn. By morning, she had made a decision. She would stay one more night just to be sure she wasn't losing her mind. Then she would pack a bag and stay in a hotel until she could resell the house. She didn't care about the money. She just needed to feel safe again. But the house wasn't finished with her. The final night began quietly. No footsteps, no breathing, no scratching. This Harley even seemed calmer, eventually dozing beside her bed. Around 2 a.m., she woke to silence. Too much silence. Harley was gone. Her heart seized. She called his name, voice trembling. No response. She climbed out of bed and walked toward the hallway. Halfway there, she heard it. A low whimper coming from downstairs. "Harley?" she whispered. The whimper grew louder, more desperate. She hurried down the stairs. The living room was empty. The kitchen, too. The whimpering came from the basement door. Behind it, the door was cracked open an inch. Harley never opened doors. He hated the basement. She hated it too. The air was always too cold, the smell too damp, the shadows too thick. She pushed the door open and called down the steps, "Harley? Come here, boy." His whining echoed faintly. She descended one step, then another. The basement was pitch black. She used her phone's flashlight, but it seemed weaker than usual, barely cutting through the dark. When she reached the bottom, she found Harley in the far corner, trembling violently, staring at something behind her. Slowly, she turned. There, in the blackness above the stairs, something shifted. A figure. Tall, distorted, limbs too long, head tilted at an impossible angle. It crawled down the steps silently, its movements jerky, wrong, like a puppet pulled by tangled strings. Megan screamed. Harley barked and lunged, trying to block it from her. The creature's head twitched toward him with a sickening crack. Then, everything happened at once. The lights flickered. The air grew freezing. The basement door slammed shut on its own. Megan grabbed Harley by the collar and bolted for the nearest wall, feeling blindly for the emergency exit window. The creature skittered across the floor behind her, its limbs scraping the concrete. She found the window latch, yanked it open, shoved Harley through first. He scrambled out into the yard. As she pulled herself up, a cold, bony hand wrapped around her ankle. She kicked wildly, screaming, feeling nails dig into her skin. She kicked again and again until the grip loosened. She hauled herself out into the night and ran barefoot across the yard, Harley beside her, both of them shaking uncontrollably. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Hands trembling, she drove away without looking back. By dawn, she was at a motel an hour away, Harley curled at her feet, neither of them sleeping. She sold the house within 2 weeks, telling the realtor she had simply changed her mind. She never went back for the rest of her belongings. But sometimes, late at night, she wakes to scratching on the motel room wall. Slow, patient, familiar. Sometimes Harley lifts his head and stares at the door, ears back, trembling. And sometimes, when the room is dark enough, she swears she hears something breathing at the foot of the bed. Story the end.